In the final weeks of 1971, when American newspapers spoke of withdrawal, and when politicians promised the war's end, there existed a mountaintop in the Central Highlands of Vietnam that appeared on no public map, mentioned in no press briefing, yet consumed helicopters from the sky and ground down young men into something less than themselves. The locals had no name for it. The Americans called it Firebase Black Ridge, and for those who survived it, the name alone could summon the smell of red mud mixed with blood, the scream of incoming mortars at dawn, and the particular terror of watching a Huey disintegrate midair while carrying men you knew by name. Staff Sergeant Jack Miller, 26 years old and already on his second tour, would later say he couldn't remember the exact coordinates, only the sensation of the earth shaking each morning like a living thing trying to throw them off. Ray Collins, 19 and fresh from basic training, kept a journal in those weeks, water-stained pages found years later in a storage unit, where he wrote simply, "The mountain is eating us." Captain Tran Hu Fong of the ARVN Rangers, a man who had fought across half of South Vietnam, told his men the first day they arrived, "We are being placed on an altar, and someone will light the match." Warrant Officer Dusty. Rhodes, a Huey pilot who flew supplies into Black Ridge 17 times, kept a piece of 12.7mm shell casing that had punched through his aircraft's fuselage. He would turn it over in his fingers decades later and whisper, "I thought I was saving them. Maybe I was just feeding the machine." This is not the story of a famous battle. Black Ridge never became Hamburger Hill or Khe Sanh. No journalist embedded there. No photographer captured its iconic moment. When it was finally abandoned, the official record listed it as a tactical redeployment with acceptable casualties and estimated enemy losses significantly higher. But for the 230 men who rotated through that fire base during its brief, violent existence, Black Ridge represented something the maps and strategies could never capture. The vast distance between what war looks like on paper and what it feels like when the paper burns. The context matters, though the men on the mountain rarely thought in those terms. By late 1971, Vietnamization was the policy, American forces drawing down while ARVN units supposedly took over. Yet the strategy required maintaining key positions, nails, driven into the map to pin down enemy movement. The Central Highlands represented the strategic heart. Whoever controlled the high ground controlled the routes down to the populated lowlands. Firebase Black Ridge sat on a razor-edge ridgeline deep in contested territory, positioned to observe and interdict branches of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and to provide artillery coverage for Kon Tum. On Lieutenant Mark Davis's map at division headquarters in Pleiku, it looked perfect, a commanding height with clear fields of fire. On the ground, as Jack Miller discovered, it was a muddy knob barely large enough for two 105mm howitzers, surrounded by higher peaks and accessible only by helicopter through weather that changed from perfect to impossible in 15 minutes. The firebase rose in late October 1971, carved from the jungle by exhausted men and explosives. Specialist Ray Collins wrote about those first days with something approaching enthusiasm. "We're building something real here. You can see the whole world from up top." The engineers came first with chainsaws and det cord, transforming primary jungle into red clay and shattered stumps. The infantry followed, digging fighting positions into the slopes, while Chinooks deposited artillery pieces and ammunition. Captain Fong's ranger company secured the outer perimeter, patrolling down the draws and ridges that radiated from the Firebase like spokes from a hub. For perhaps 2 weeks, there was an illusion of control. American firepower deployed on dominant terrain, helicopters moving freely, the war seemingly manageable. But the forest below watched with patient eyes. Fong's patrols began finding things, fresh trails that weren't there before, discarded Soviet ration tins, fighting positions dug into the reverse slopes of nearby ridges, all pointing to a presence both organized and deliberate. The first contacts were brief, a burst of AK fire, an RPG that missed, shadows melting back into the green. Yet each encounter revealed more about the enemy's capabilities and intentions. They were close, they were numerous, and they were studying Black Ridge the way a surgeon studies an anatomy chart. The psychological shift occurred gradually, then suddenly. Ray Collins stopped writing about the view and started writing about the silence. The birds don't sing anymore, he noted. Even the insects seem to have left. Jack Miller briefed his platoon differently now, emphasizing immediate reaction drills and casualty evacuation procedures rather than aggressive patrolling. The change from boredom to dread is rarely linear in war. It accumulates like water behind a dam until something cracks. For Black Ridge, that crack came at 0547 on a November morning, when the first mortar barrage arrived without warning, without ranging shots, the rounds impacting directly on the helicopter pad with the precision of long observation and careful plotting. The siege that followed wasn't announced with bugles or human wave attacks. It was methodical, professional, and terrifying in its patience. The enemy had positioned mortars and rockets on the higher ground that surrounded Black Ridge on 3 sides, peaks that the Americans hadn't occupied because they lacked sufficient force to defend multiple positions. Each day brought bombardment at irregular intervals, disrupting sleep, destroying morale, inflicting casualties that seemed random but accumulated relentlessly. A man could survive 20 bombardments and die on the 21st when a single piece of shrapnel found the gap between his helmet and his flak jacket. The randomness was part of the weapon. 19-year-old Private First Class Loam, a ranger in Fong's company, came from rice farming country in central Vietnam. He carried a letter from his mother, folded so many times the creases had nearly separated the paper into pieces. During bombardments, he would hold it against his chest like a talisman, not reading it because the light was too dangerous, just feeling its presence. Years later, running a lottery ticket stand in Saigon, he would tell a journalist, "I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid my mother would never know exactly where I died, because that place had no name in Vietnamese." The environment itself became an antagonist. The Central Highlands in late 1971 brought rain that could turn a fighting position into a swamp in 30 minutes. Red clay became slick as oil, trenches collapsed, sandbags rotted, leeches infested every wet place, and men would burn them off with cigarettes, creating small burns that then infected. Malaria and dysentery moved through the Firebase, despite the prophylaxis, turning strong men into shivering ghosts. The smell was particular: wet canvas, human waste, gun oil, the sweet rot smell of garbage that couldn't be burned because smoke drew fire, and underneath it all, the metallic scent of blood that never quite went away. At night, the Firebase became a different place. The listening posts reported movement, sometimes confirmed by trip flares that revealed nothing, sometimes just the sound of metal on metal in the distance. The the distinctive clink of ammunition being prepared. Illumination rounds would drift down on their parachutes, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. In the bunkers, men sat with weapons across their laps, trying not to think about the fact that several tons of artillery ammunition sat 20 yards away, that a lucky hit could vaporize the entire hilltop, that being underground might mean being buried alive. Ray Collins stopped sleeping more than 90 minutes at a stretch. His journal entries became fragments. Tuesday, I think, raining, Harris got it, didn't see his face after. And later, just can't remember what quiet sounds like. Jack Miller, the staff sergeant who'd seen combat before, found this different from his first tour. In 1968, you could patrol, make contact, call in airstrikes, and feel like you were doing something. Here, on Black Ridge, they were static, predictable, and the enemy could choose when and how to engage. It violated every tactical principle Miller had learned, but orders were orders. When he asked the company commander about more aggressive operations to clear the surrounding peaks, the answer came back: insufficient helicopter assets, insufficient infantry. The Firebase's mission was fire support, not maneuver warfare. So they sat and took it. Then the sky became contested territory. The North Vietnamese had learned from American helicopter tactics over 6 years of war, and they'd adapted. Anti-aircraft positions, 12.7 mm, 14.5 mm, even some 37 mm guns, were carefully positioned on the slopes overlooking the most common approach routes to Black Ridge. They waited until helicopters were committed to landing, rotor blades flared, airspeed bleeding off, no ability to maneuver sharply. Then they opened fire from multiple positions simultaneously, creating a cone of tracers that few aircraft could avoid. Warrant Officer Dusty Rhodes was 24 and had believed himself immortal in the way young pilots do. The first time he flew into Black Ridge, it seemed routine. Pick up supplies at Pleiku, 30-minute flight, land, unload, take wounded or personnel back. The Firebase looked small from the air, a scar of red earth amid endless green, the artillery pieces like toys. But on his third mission, he watched another Huey, one he'd shared beers with the pilot the night before, take fire on approach. The aircraft shuddered, the tail rotor separated, and it entered an uncontrollable spin before impacting the slope in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. Rhodes still had to land because men were waiting for the ammunition he carried. He came in fast and steep, flared hard, and felt his own ship taking hits. The distinctive bang of heavy machine guns punching through aluminum. His crew chief was wounded. They were on the ground less than 40 seconds before pulling pitch and diving away, using the terrain to mask their escape. That night, Rhodes counted 11 holes in his aircraft. The crew chief lived, but went home with one kidney. From that point forward, helicopter operations into Black Ridge became a calculus of desperation versus necessity. Pilots knew the odds, but flew anyway because abandoning the Firebase meant abandoning the men there. Resupply missions came at dawn when mist might provide concealment, or during heavy weather when the enemy couldn't see to shoot, which also meant flying blind through mountains. Medical evacuations happened whenever possible, which increasingly meant never. The radio calls became harder to answer. Dust-off required urgent surgical, hostile fire at LZ. And the response, stand by, followed sometimes by unable due to weather, followed eventually by the silence of men who understood they were on their own. On the Firebase, The soldiers watched the sky with an ambivalence bordering on dread. The sound of helicopter rotors meant supplies, mail, a tenuous connection to the world beyond the perimeter, but it also meant someone was about to risk death on their behalf, and sometimes that risk didn't pay off. Private Collins witnessed a Chinook take fire while hovering over the ammunition pad, the helicopter already unloading when tracers stitched up its fuselage. The crew kept the aircraft steady long enough to drop its cargo before pulling away trailing smoke. But the door gunner had been killed, and his body fell when the helicopter banked hard. Collins stopped writing in his journal after that. When asked later why, he said simply, "There weren't words for it that I knew." Captain Fong understood siege warfare in a way the Americans didn't, because he'd fought in places like this before, positions that existed primarily to draw enemy attention and resources, that were defended until they became indefensible, then abandoned with whatever could be carried out. He knew the pattern, first the isolation, then the attrition, then the decision point, when holding on cost more than letting go. What troubled him was how long the Americans would wait before reaching that decision, and how many of his Rangers would die in the interim. He'd lost 11 men already, 6 to mortars, 3 to a botched patrol that walked into an ambush, 2 to infected wounds because the medevac couldn't come. The traditional path for an ARVN officer was deference to American advisors, but Fong had stopped deferring. In a contentious meeting with the American battalion commander, he stated flatly, "The enemy holds the high ground. Every day we stay, they study us. They will kill us all unless we move." The American colonel, looking at his map where Black Ridge still showed as a key terrain feature, responded, "Intelligence hasn't confirmed enemy heavy weapons in this area." Fong looked at the colonel for a long moment, then said, "Tell that to the intelligence officer's corpse. He was in my company." The meeting ended poorly. At division headquarters in Pleiku, First Lieutenant Mark Davis worked 16-hour shifts in the operations center, a climate-controlled room where the war existed as colored pins on maps and casualty figures in reports. Davis was 27, Princeton educated, believed in systems and data-driven decisions. Black Ridge appeared on his map as a red circle with the notation A114, indicating an understrength infantry company. Around it, blue circles showed friendly positions. Red circles showed known enemy locations. On the map, Black Ridge looked viable, providing artillery coverage of key routes, supporting operations toward the border. The casualty reports troubled Davis, but they remained within acceptable parameters, as defined by operational planning. What Davis couldn't see from his map were faces, couldn't hear the particular sound of a man dying slowly from gut wounds, couldn't smell the fierce sweat in a bunker when the incoming started. Numbers were clean. War wasn't. The breaking point came incrementally. A supply helicopter crashed on approach, killing the crew and destroying the supplies. A mortar hit the aid station, killing the medic and 3 wounded men. A patrol went out and didn't come back. 6 Rangers, including Lam's best friend. Their bodies found days later in a ravine, stripped of weapons and equipment. Each incident alone was manageable, but together they created a sense of inevitability, a mathematical certainty that everyone's number would eventually come up. Ray Collins began exhibiting symptoms of what would later be called PTSD, hypervigilance, inability to eat, detachment. Jack Miller noticed his hands shaking whenever he tried to light a cigarette, so he stopped trying. The Firebase was running out of men faster than replacements could arrive. assuming helicopters could bring them. The radio call came late on a December night, coded but clear enough. Prepare for extraction. After weeks of insisting Black Ridge was essential, Division had reversed course. The official explanation would be redeployment to support operations elsewhere. But everyone understood the truth. They were abandoning the Firebase because holding it was bleeding the battalion dry for diminishing returns. Jack Miller listened to the operations order with his platoon sergeants and felt a complicated mix of relief and shame. Relief because they might survive this. Shame because the men who died here had died for a position now deemed not worth keeping. The withdrawal plan was textbook. Reduce personnel gradually over several days under cover of normal supply operations. Destroy equipment that couldn't be evacuated, retain a security force until the final extraction, then collapse the perimeter and lift everyone out in a single wave. In practice, it was chaos held together by professionalism and desperation. The North Vietnamese weren't fools. They noticed the increased helicopter traffic, the reduced patrolling, the preparations. Their bombardment intensified as if to prevent exactly what was happening. The engineers wired the ammunition bunkers and the artillery pieces with demolition charges. If the enemy wanted Black Ridge, they'd inherit a crater. The final day broke with heavy mist, a blessing that concealed movement, but also made flying treacherous. Captain Fong's Rangers formed the last line, dug in around the landing zone, covering the withdrawal. Inside the perimeter, a small fire base that once held over 200 men now sheltered fewer than 50. The plan called for 4 lifts, Hueys landing in pairs, loading and departing, while Cobras provided suppressive fire. Dusty Rhodes was flying lead ship for the second lift, knowing that by then the enemy would be fully alert. Private Leam was in the last group scheduled to leave. He'd written a final letter to his mother, in his mind because there was no paper and no way to mail it, telling her he was coming home. Around him, the fire base was being systematically destroyed. Radios smashed, documents burned, the last artillery rounds fired off in a wasteful barrage just to deny them to the enemy. The sound was apocalyptic. Outgoing fire, incoming fire, helicopter engines, demolition charges cooking off in sequence. Ray Collins, by now barely functional, was loaded onto the first helicopter with the walking wounded. He remembered nothing of the flight out except that it was bumpy. Jack Miller was on the third lift, and he stood on the landing zone coordinating the loading while mortars impacted across the fire base. A round landed near enough that the blast wave threw him down, and he lay there for a moment tasting blood and dirt, wondering if he was dying. Then hands pulled him up, Fong's Rangers, the last men still fighting, and shoved him toward a helicopter. He climbed aboard and watched through the door gunner's position as Black Ridge receded below. And in that moment, the demolition charges detonated. The ammunition bunkers went up first, a rippling series of explosions that turned the hillside into a volcanic eruption of mud and fire. The artillery pieces, rigged with thermite grenades, burned white hot. Within seconds, the fire base ceased to exist as anything but smoke and flame. The final helicopter lifted off carrying Fong, Lom, and the last dozen Rangers. They'd held the perimeter until the demolitions were set, then collapsed inward in a fighting withdrawal that left 3 men behind, dead or wounded too severely to move. Lom never learned which. As his helicopter banked away, he looked back once and saw the mountain returning to jungle, the fires already diminishing, the rain beginning to fall. Within a week, he knew, the forest would reclaim the site. Within a month, you'd never know Americans had been there. The thought should have been comforting, the jungle healing itself, but instead it felt like erasure. In Pleiku, Lieutenant Davis updated the operations map. The red circle for Black Ridge was removed. In its place went a notation: position evacuated per Oplan 7122, enemy casualties estimated 200 plus, friendly losses minimal. Davis signed the report and filed it, then went to the latrine and vomited. He wasn't sure why. The operation had been a success by every metric that mattered to his superiors. They'd denied the terrain to the enemy for 2 months, inflicted casualties, and withdrawn in good order. But later that night, he took a bottle of whiskey to the roof of the headquarters building and drank while watching the distant mountains, where Black Ridge lay invisible in the darkness. He kept drinking until he could no longer remember the names from the casualty reports, though that particular amnesia never lasted. The aftermath scattered survivors across geography and time. Ray Collins was medically evacuated to Japan, then stateside, where he received a diagnosis he didn't understand and medications that didn't help. He gained weight, married, divorced, worked as a truck driver, and kept the water damage journal in a safety deposit box he never opened. On July 4th every year, when fireworks began, he'd lie flat on the floor of his apartment until they stopped, and he never understood why this embarrassed him more than anything else about his life. Jack Miller returned to California, grew a beard, took a job in construction where the physical work helped, and the noise didn't trigger anything. He rarely spoke about Vietnam, but other veterans could recognize each other, and occasionally in a bar someone would ask where he'd served. He'd list places, Pleiku, Kon Tum, and sometimes someone would say, "Were you at that firebase they abandoned up in the Highlands?" And Miller would nod once and change the subject. He never attended reunions because he couldn't stand the way men told war stories, cleaning up the truth until it resembled something noble. Dusty Rhodes kept flying helicopters commercially because it was the only thing that made sense to him anymore. He flew oil rig crews in the Gulf of Mexico, never mentioning that turbulence made him sweat, or that certain cloud formations reminded him of muzzle flashes. The piece of shrapnel sat on his desk, and sometimes his kids would ask about it. He'd tell them it was from his time in the army, nothing more, because how do you explain to a child that you saved men by delivering them into hell, and that this made you a hero and a participant in their suffering simultaneously? Captain Fong was imprisoned after 1975 in re-education camps, where former ARVN officers were taught the era of serving American imperialism. He spent 7 years in the camps, and when he was released, he was 20 pounds lighter and 40 years older in his eyes. He worked as a cyclo-driver in Ho Chi Minh City, and tourists would sometimes ask about the war. He'd shake his head and pedal on. But once, a French journalist specifically asked about Black Ridge, apparently doing research on forgotten battles, and Fong stopped the cyclo and sat silent for a full minute before saying, "I lost 12 men holding a position my own commanders didn't believe in. You want to write about that?" The journalist didn't use the quote. Private Loam survived, made it home to his mother, then watched as the war took everything anyway when the North came south in 1975. He sold lottery tickets and did odd jobs and kept the letter his mother had written, though she died in 1983. When his grandson asked him about the war, Lum would say only, "I was on a mountain once where helicopters died in the sky. It wasn't on any map. That's all I remember." This was a lie, He remembered everything, but truth served no purpose anymore. Lieutenant Davis became a professor of military history, teaching at a small college in Pennsylvania, where he lectured on operational planning and strategic decision-making. He was good at his job, respected, published papers on force employment and coalition warfare. But he never wrote about Black Ridge, and when former students asked about his service, he was vague. Once, in a faculty meeting discussing academic integrity, he found himself saying, "Numbers don't lie, but they don't tell the truth either," and then couldn't explain what he meant. Firebase Black Ridge appears in no official battle histories. The after-action report lists it as a successful economy of force operation that fixed significant enemy units while allowing redeployment of U.S. forces consistent with Vietnamization goals. Casualty figures are recorded: 24 U.S. KIA, 67 WIA, 15 ARVN KIA, 43 WIA, 11 MIA, 3 aircraft destroyed, 7 damaged. Enemy casualties estimated at 200 plus KIA. By the calculus of attrition warfare, this represented a favorable exchange ratio. The firebase existed for 63 days. What the record doesn't capture is the way Jack Miller still flinches at sudden noises, or how Ray Collins measures his life in the minutes between anxiety attacks, or how Fong occasionally dreams he's still on that hilltop and the helicopters are never coming. The record doesn't include Lum's mother's letter, dissolved finally by water and time, or the names of Fong's rangers who died on a mountain that officially never mattered. It doesn't count the marriage that failed, because Dusty Rhodes couldn't explain why he woke up swinging, or the bottle Mark Davis empties alone each year on the anniversary of the evacuation order he helped write. These absences are themselves a kind of record, negative space where experience resists documentation. Black Ridge was one firebase among hundreds, one fight among thousands, notable primarily for being unnoteworthy. No journalist was present, no photographer captured its iconic moment. It became legend only among those who survived it, and even then, legend is perhaps too grand a word. It became a scar, personal and invisible, carried in the body's memory of fear and in the mind's inability to reconcile the gap between what was asked and what was possible. The mountain itself remains, of course. The jungle reclaimed it within months. The crater where the ammunition bunker exploded probably still holds fragments of American and Vietnamese metal rusting into the red soil. Trees grow through old fighting positions. Monsoons wash away the last traces of sandbags and concertina wire. If you could stand there today, and few can, because the area remains remote and the government doesn't encourage battlefield tourism, you'd see only forest and, perhaps, if you looked carefully, depressions in the earth that might once have been trenches. The mountain doesn't remember. Only the men do, and they're dying now, one by one, taking their specific memories with them until all that remains is the official record with its acceptable losses and successful redeployments. Yet something persists beyond individual memory. In veteran support groups, in late-night conversations between old soldiers, in the occasional academic paper on forgotten battles, Black Ridge surfaces as example and metaphor. It represents all the places that strategic thinking sacrificed tactical reality, where the map's clean lines met the mud's brutal truth. It's a name that carries weight for those who know it, worthless to those who don't, which perhaps makes it the perfect emblem of modern war's peculiar accounting, where everything is measured and nothing is truly counted. The question that haunts survivors isn't whether holding Black Ridge was strategically sound. They lack the information to judge that, and strategic soundness feels abstract when measured against specific deaths. The question is simpler and more terrible. What does it mean to suffer for something that leaves no trace? To defend ground that will be abandoned? To risk everything for a position that strategic planners mark for withdrawal, even while demanding its defense? The answer, if there is one, lies not in the decisions made at headquarters, but in the moment-to-moment choices in the mud. To keep fighting when everything says it's pointless. To evacuate a wounded man knowing it might cost your life. To board that last helicopter or stay behind with those who can't leave. Black Ridge fell silent in December 1971, and the war went on without it. Other bases were established and abandoned. Other men died in other forgotten places, and eventually even the war itself became history, contested, reinterpreted, fading. But for those 230 men who spent any time on that unnamed mountaintop, Black Ridge remained permanently present. It was the place they learned that courage and futility could coexist, that you could do everything right and still lose, that war's darkest truth isn't death, but the specific, intimate ways it makes death meaningless. They carried it home, Jack and Ray and Fong and Lom and Dusty and Davis and all the others, carried it through marriages and jobs and children and grandchildren, a weight invisible to anyone who hadn't been there, heavy as the mountain itself, impossible to explain, because explanation requires shared language, and no language exists for certain experiences except the silence between veterans who know. And so Black Ridge persists not on maps, but in that silence, in the pause, before an old man answers his grandson's question about the war, in the moment between fireworks and the floor, in the nightmares that arrive without warning decades after the last helicopter departed. It persists as a reminder that history's footnotes contain as much truth as its headlines, that the wars we remember are built on foundations of wars we've forgotten, and that the gap between strategic success and human cost can be measured in blood, but never truly reconciled. The mountain doesn't care. Mountains never do. But the men who fought there, who died there, who survived there, and wish sometimes they hadn't, they remember. And in their remembering, Black Ridge endures, a ghost firebase haunting the margins of a war that itself has become a ghost, teaching anyone who listens the oldest lesson, that what we build in war is never what we intended, and that what we abandon is never truly left behind.